What if the world's third largest economy, once a symbol of invincibility, was quietly collapsing? Japan, a nation that once set the bar for economic success, is now facing a rapid decline like no one could have predicted. But what is driving this collapse? Let's unravel the hidden forces that have been at play for decades. In 2024, Japan's economic standing has reached a terrifying low. The yen has hit its lowest point in 34 years, and Japan's once towering GDP has stagnated to the point where South Korea has surpassed it in per capita income. The shift from a thriving global powerhouse to a struggling nation seems almost overnight. But how did this happen? For decades, Japan was a symbol of resilience, its economy soaring after World War II. Yet, as the world's third largest economy faces crisis, we must ask, what went wrong? How could such a rapidly declining powerhouse slip into stagnation? The roots of this fall go back to decisions made in the 1980 seconds, when Japan seemed unstoppable on the global stage. In the 1980 seconds, Japan's industrial dominance was second to none. Electronics, automobiles, and steel production were global standards. Yet, as the decade progressed, there were warning signs. Japan's reliance on exports, its limited internal consumption, and growing trade imbalances were all overlooked. Could Japan's own success have been its undoing? Did the system Japan built for its recovery after World War II create a fragile foundation for its future? These questions point to a deeper issue. The structure of Japan's economy wasn't as secure as it seemed. What many saw as a miracle was, in fact, an economic system teetering on the edge. And when the bubble burst in the early 1990 seconds, it set the stage for decades of struggle. The fall of Japan's economic power didn't happen overnight. It was a slow unraveling, and the signs were there, if only anyone had been paying attention. But now, the question remains. How did Japan go from being the model of economic success to a country on the brink of economic ruin? And more importantly, what can the world learn from its mistakes? In the aftermath of World War II, Japan was nothing more than a shadow of its former self. Cities lay in ruins, the country's industries shattered, and the future seemed uncertain. Yet, just 2 decades later, Japan would rise from the ashes to become the world's second largest economy. How did this happen? It wasn't magic. It was strategy. Japan's post-war recovery was meticulously planned. In 1946, Japan's industrial giants were dismantled as part of the Allies' efforts to prevent future militarism. Large conglomerates, or zaibatsu, were broken up, and land reforms drastically altered the rural economy. Nearly half of Japan's land was redistributed, empowering farmers and broadening the middle class. But perhaps the most pivotal moment came when Yoshida Shigeru, Japan's prime minister, made a crucial decision. The government would minimize military spending, focusing all available resources on economic recovery. This bold move laid the foundation for Japan's later success. While military budgets in other nations skyrocketed, Japan devoted itself to rebuilding. Its defense was outsourced to the United States under the protection of the U.S. military umbrella. In exchange for this, the United States helped Japan open its markets to the world, starting a period of immense industrial growth. Japan's early recovery was fueled by American support technologies were transferred and trade opened up. By 1953, Japanese exports skyrocketed by 143%, vastly outpacing the US and the UK. But the success didn't stop there. Japan's education system, which had been building since the Meiji era, played a crucial role. In the 1950 seconds, Japan's literacy rate was nearly 100%. And by the 1960 seconds, nearly every teenager graduated high school. With a workforce of skilled, disciplined workers, Japan quickly outpaced its competition in the manufacturing sector. Japan's recovery was also fueled by its embrace of foreign technologies. Companies like Toyota and Sony partnered with Western firms, exchanging Japanese ingenuity with cutting-edge technologies. Toyota learned from General Motors, while Sony absorbed expertise in electronics. But what Japan did next was the game changer. It didn't just adopt foreign technology, it improved on it. Innovations like the Toyota production system, known for its efficiency and focus on quality, became global benchmarks. In 1965, just 20 years after the war ended, Japan was recording trade surpluses. Its economy was back on track, but not just recovering. Japan had surpassed expectations and set the stage for its meteoric rise as a global economic power. But as Japan's economy grew, so too did the pressures building beneath the surface. The very strategies that had propelled it to the top might have, in the end, set it up for failure. Japan had learned to adapt and innovate. But was it too much? Was it already beginning to stretch its resources too thin? These questions would soon take on greater significance as Japan faced new challenges in the coming decades. Japan's rise in the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds was nothing short of extraordinary. In just a few decades, it had transformed from a war-torn nation to an economic powerhouse, surpassing many established economies. Its innovations in manufacturing, technology, and exports reshaped global industries. But this seemingly unstoppable force was not without its flaws. The miracle behind Japan's economic boom was its unparalleled efficiency and commitment to quality. The concept of kaizen, or continuous improvement, became the backbone of Japanese manufacturing. Companies like Toyota revolutionized the automotive industry, while Sony, Panasonic, and other electronics firms became household names worldwide. In the 1970 seconds, Japan's reputation for precision, reliability and innovation turned it into the manufacturing center of the world. Japan's export-driven growth was fueled by its focus on technology and heavy industry. The country became a global leader in automobiles, electronics, and machinery. By the 1980 seconds, Made in Japan was no longer associated with cheap, inferior products. Instead, it signified top-tier quality and advanced technology. Japan was, in many ways, the model of modern industrialization. However, behind the glittering success, cracks were beginning to show. Japan's economy was built on an export-driven model, heavily reliant on global demand. As the world economy changed, Japan's narrow focus on manufacturing left it vulnerable to external shocks. It also became increasingly clear that the nation's financial system was becoming more speculative than productive. Despite Japan's industrial success, its internal consumption remained low, and its reliance on exports left the economy susceptible to global downturns. The country's financial markets began to overheat, and a dangerous culture of speculation took root. Land and stock prices soared to unsustainable levels, creating an illusion of prosperity. But this bubble would soon burst, with devastating consequences. For all its strengths, Japan's economic miracle had overlooked fundamental structural issues. Its corporate culture, while efficient, was rigid, and its banking system encouraged risky investments rather than long-term sustainable growth. As Japan's economy grew, so did its vulnerabilities. The foundation that had supported its rapid rise was becoming increasingly fragile. Shocking fact. The very success that made Japan the envy of the world may have in the end been the source of its downfall. Was the pursuit of growth at any cost too much for the country to bear? Could Japan have avoided the impending collapse if it had adapted its model of growth sooner? These were the questions Japan would have to confront as the economic miracle began to unravel. The bubble was swelling, but no one knew when it would burst or how devastating the consequences would be when it did. By the late 1980 seconds, Japan was in the midst of an economic frenzy. The world looked on in awe as the country's stock market and real estate values skyrocketed, seemingly without limits. Tokyo's property market, in particular, became a symbol of Japan's economic prosperity. Land prices soared to astronomical heights, with 1 square meter of land in Tokyo's upscale Ginza district valued higher than the entire state of California. The bubble had expanded so much that it seemed as though nothing could bring it down. But this was not true prosperity. It was an illusion. Japan's rapid economic success, driven by speculative investments in real estate and stocks, was built on shaky ground. The country had entered a dangerous game of high-risk, high-reward speculation. In the stock market, investors were betting large sums, convinced that prices would only go up. Likewise, real estate values were inflated by widespread speculation. The government, eager to maintain economic momentum, fueled this growth through low interest rates and easy credit. However, the world's economic dynamics were changing. In 1985, the Plaza Accord saw a major shift in currency markets. The yen appreciated dramatically, making Japanese exports more expensive and less competitive on the global market. This sudden change had immediate and far-reaching effects on the Japanese economy. The country's manufacturing sector, once the engine of its growth, began to slow down as foreign markets turned away from Japan's goods. Despite the warnings, Japan's bubble economy continued to expand, growing more detached from reality. The speculative frenzy was reaching new heights, and businesses across the nation, manufacturers, financial institutions, and even small businesses were caught up in the fever. The bubble was growing larger, and the risks were becoming more apparent, but no one was willing to acknowledge the impending disaster. Shocking fact. In the late 1980s, Japan's stock market capitalization surpassed that of the United States. For a moment, it seemed as though Japan would soon overtake the US not as the world's most powerful economic force. But in less than 2 years, everything would come crashing down. The inevitable happened in 1990. The Japanese stock market began to fall. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force was suddenly unraveling. Land prices, once so inflated, began to plummet. By 1991, real estate prices had dropped by 40%, and the stock market lost nearly half of its value. In just a matter of months, Japan's economic miracle had turned into a nightmare. The once booming financial markets became a source of tremendous loss, with corporations, banks, and everyday citizens feeling the sharp sting of the burst bubble. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Major banks, deeply involved in real estate lending, saw their assets evaporate. Companies that had heavily invested in speculative assets found themselves facing huge losses. Many of the same businesses that had once been hailed as symbols of Japanese innovation were now on the brink of collapse. Shocking fact. By 1992, Japanese banks had accumulated an estimated $300 billion in bad loans, which they were unable to recover. The cost of this economic collapse would continue to haunt Japan for decades. The bubble had burst, and Japan's economy was on the brink of total collapse. But as it fell, the country's policymakers struggled to find a way out. What had gone wrong? Was it simply a matter of bad luck? Or were there deeper, systemic issues at play? The questions remained unanswered, and Japan was left to pick up the pieces, unsure of how to recover from the greatest economic disaster it had ever faced. The burst of Japan's economic bubble in the early 1990s marked the beginning of what would become known as the lost decade. But as the years dragged on, it became evident that Japan's economic struggles were not just a temporary setback. The country was entering a prolonged period of stagnation that would affect every aspect of its society. Japan's leaders, still clinging to the hope that the economy would rebound, tried everything to revive it. They pushed for aggressive fiscal policies, lowered interest rates to historic lows, and introduced stimulus programs. But despite these efforts, growth remained stagnant. By the mid-1990s, Japan's economy was in a state of paralysis. The once unstoppable force of Japan's economic rise had ground to a halt. The signs were everywhere. Unemployment rates remained low, but wages stagnated. The country's aging population was placing increasing pressure on its social safety net, yet little was done to address the underlying demographic problems. Japan's workforce, once renowned for its discipline and efficiency, was now trapped in a cycle of stagnation. What caused this stagnation? Was it the global economic slowdown, or was it something more deeply embedded in Japan's economic structure? One of the key factors was Japan's failure to restructure its economy. The country remained heavily reliant on the export model that had served it well in the post-war era. But, by the 1990s, the global economy had changed. Competition was fiercer, and Japan's traditional industries were no longer as competitive. At the same time, Japan's financial institutions were still reeling from the aftershocks of the asset bubble. With bad loans piling up, banks were reluctant to lend, which stifled investment. The government, instead of addressing the systemic issues in the financial sector, chose to bail out failing institutions, perpetuating the cycle of inefficiency. The result? A country caught in a constant state of financial limbo. Shocking fact. By 2000, Japan's GDP growth rate was one of the lowest among developed nations, averaging less than 1% per year. This was in stark contrast to the growth rates of the US and other major economies, which were experiencing booms during the same period. But the deeper problem was Japan's unwillingness to change its core systems. The country's traditional corporate structure, with its lifetime employment system and rigid hierarchy, had created an economy that was slow to adapt to change. The government's resistance to structural reform kept Japan in a state of stagnation. And as the years passed, It became clear that the economic malaise Japan was experiencing wasn't just a temporary issue. It was a deep, systemic problem. Could Japan have avoided this long period of stagnation if it had embraced change earlier? The country's leaders had failed to address the real structural problems in its economy, and the consequences were now clear. A generation of young people faced an uncertain future, and the hope for a revival seemed to be slipping further away. The last decade was more than just a decade of economic failure. It was a symbol of how a nation's inability to evolve can lead to a long-term economic crisis. Japan's failure to adapt to the changing global landscape, coupled with a refusal to reform its internal systems, created an economic trap that would take decades to escape. Shocking fact. Japan's lost decade was not just a financial disaster. It marked the beginning of a long-term societal shift. By the early 2000s, the country was facing widespread disillusionment, with young people increasingly abandoning traditional career paths for more unconventional routes. The dream of economic prosperity was fading, and Japan was left to ponder whether it could ever regain its former glory.